I'm going to also do this live on Facebook, if that's cool too with you. And it always does this weird thing where once I go live, then we'll hear ourselves. So I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I'll close it down before we have that feedback problem. Any second, let me just load that up here. Have that feedback. There it is. Okay. Like there's no way around it. I thought, oh, well, I'll catch it right before it goes, but no, you can't. Anyway, I have a couple more people coming in. Maybe I'll make Larea co-host so that you can let other people in if I miss people.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, y'all, I'm really excited about this talk. Thank you all for coming. And if you are trying to get CE credit for this course, it is still pending CE credit for some reason. This usually doesn't take so long, so I don't know what the deal is. But we have a number for it, and I will submit your stuff. We will have you fill out a little survey that I'll link to near the end of this talk, and then you can fill out the survey. You only get credit if it is approved for attending live. So watch out for that link, fill out the survey, and then I'll submit you to get credit. And if you miss that link for whatever reason, you can always email me at info@ourhonor.org. And we do want to keep these CEs free and accessible to all. So if you are able to donate, please do. And we accept Venmo at Our Honor, or you can go to ourhonor.org/donate. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marek Muller, is a assistant professor of communication studies at Texas State University with a specialization in arguments regarding animal welfare, rights, and ethics. They've published several articles on the subject, including a book, Impersonating Animals, which was published by the Michigan State University Press in 2020. Their work is especially concerned with models of animal justice that intersect with human-centered movements surrounding equity, access, and inclusion, since after all, we are all part of Kingdom Animalia. And take it away, Marek. Where'd you go? Oh, there you
go. I'm here. I'm here. I promise I'm here.
I see you.
All right, so I am just going to hop right into it and start sharing my screen with you. It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me again. My screen is loading, and now I believe you should be able to see it. So let's hit this slideshow. All right. Can everybody see it? Is everybody happy?
Looks good.
All right, great. Let's take off. So my presentation for you today is called Treated Like Animals, Human and Non-Human Animal Abuse in the Slaughterhouse. As stated, my name is Marek Muller. I teach at Texas State University in the Department of Communication Studies. So I have a few goals for tonight that'll hopefully take us where we need to go. I'll introduce myself a little more purely so that this will help contextualize the lecture before I end up inevitably addressing what we're gonna all know is an elephant in the room regarding the subject of this talk. At which point that'll lead us into a framework that I would like us to use as we sort of think about this issue of solidarity with frontline workers in the slaughterhouse, which I'm going to just call comorbidity. We're going to look at physical, psychological, and cultural comorbidities. That'll lead us into a brief Q&A and hopefully a fruitful discussion on paths forward as we think through this difficult topic. So I'd like to start with what I think is a really powerful quote. It actually comes from my home state of Texas by the journalist James McWilliams, who wrote a really haunting piece for the Texas Observer called PTSD in the Slaughterhouse. McWilliams writes, "It's often said that consumers are disconnected from the meat we eat. Rarely noted is the fact that the slaughterhouse is a site of unfathomable connectivity. The most intimate and blood-stained bond between humans and the animals we consume is forged between nearly voiceless slaughterhouse workers and the animals they are employed to kill. I think this is a very powerful quote because most of us in this room are probably very aware of the timely and timeless quote, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarians and vegans. But when we see that by this quote, I think we start to realize if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we would not simply see the non-human animals being slaughtered. We would see quite a bit of actual labor abuse taking place with the human animals who are currently being employed to slaughter our poor non-human animal friends. So what do I actually study? What makes me qualified to be here? Well, primarily, I am a scholar of environmental communication. Some fundamentals of my practice is that what we say about animals, human and non-human animals, will necessarily impact how we think about them, and then, of course, how we treat them. Fundamental to what we say about animals, what we think about animals, and what we do to animals are two processes that are often thought of as separate, but I almost think of them as synonyms: dehumanization and animalization. Dehumanization is a term we typically apply to human animals when some aspect of their humanness is being taken away from them in a manner that allows us to exploit them. Animalization is typically used in the same framework, but is often applied by scholars of animals themselves to discuss the processes by which we come to think of other creatures as animals, but humans as somehow not animal. And again, this is often used to justify oppressive behavior. These are overlapping psychological phenomenon and linguistic phenomenon. So we say it, we think it, we do it. So language and psychology, these are fundamentally categorical disciplines. How we categorize animals impacts who is animalized and why they are animalized. And in fact, it's not just what you say, it's also where you are. Physical proximity, or proxemics, that's a form of nonverbal communication. So physical proximity to non-human animals can also naturalize these processes of dehumanization and animalization. Though being in the category of animal is not prima facie bad, there's something bad about being not human. Linguistic and material processes of dehumanization and animalization can have violent real-world results, because if it has been established over and over through discourse and through practice that this category of animal means you are less than, to become animal, whether it is prima facie bad or not, is still not a desirable thing. And it's often a little too convenient who ends up animalized and who doesn't through these discursive, material, and psychological processes. So for this lecture, I'm drawing upon some of my prior publications. One that was published in the peer-reviewed journal American Studies. It's called U.S. Industrial Processes of Livestock Slaughter. And another is a chapter in a book that was actually released just a couple of weeks ago. Highly recommend it. It's an edited collection called Building Resistance Against Multi-Species Exploitation, which looks at the intersections of labor rights and animal rights as interconnected movements that need to be talking more. And within these publications, there are 5 fundamental principles that I'd really like to make sure everyone knows right off the bat. The first is pretty obvious. First, that slaughterhouses run counter to principles that I think we in this room generally share, principles of animal rights and welfare, and if you will, animal liberation. Slaughterhouses are sites of unneeded violence and mass loss of non-human animal life. There are more non-human animals slaughtered every year than humans have ever existed on this planet. But, and this is where people start to sort of run away from me, stay with me, the workers on the line, the front line, literally the killers, if you will, at these slaughterhouses, they're not our enemies. In fact, we should advocate for them like we advocate for the innocent animals, the innocent non-human animals that these human animals kill for their jobs. And I say this because both parties are actually needless victims of processes such as discrimination, exploitation, and figurative, symbolic, and literal material violence in the name of corporate profit. So just, again, let's take a moment to address the elephant in the room. No, the scale of death, the scale of the systemic violence between those working on the front line in a slaughterhouse and those who are slaughtered in the slaughterhouse is not comparable. We have tens of billions of cows, chickens, pigs, and sheep slaughtered. That's a number pulled from 2022. And that was just in the US. Standardized slaughter methods, the ones that are theoretically okay, they're cruel. Shackling, stunning, suspending, bleeding. There's nothing fun about that. There's nothing humane about that. That's not even counting the deaths that happen, not even in the process of procuring meat, like male chicks killed for being useless in an egg factory, baby cows slaughtered for veal, at the point where they die before they really even get a chance to be. Not talking about the inhumane confinement that results in psychological distress that manifests in physical illnesses, like the case of bird flu we're currently seeing going around, and that needs to be talked about a lot more. And of course, that's not even including the consistent undercover videos showing animal cruelty, including the beating of live animals before their slaughter, often by the very frontline slaughterhouse employees, who I'm going to proceed to argue we need to be advocating for. This is the elephant in the room, and at no point am I going to say, yes, animal slaughter is okay. Yes, these pictures are okay. Yes, this treatment is okay. No, it's not okay. So I care. Well, I'd like to refer to what I think is a very meaningful quote by the scholar named Nikisha Alexis, who wrote this in a really poignant chapter called Beyond Suffering, Resisting Patriarchy and Reproductive Control. Although cruelty must not be excused, it is crucial to link the trauma factory farm employees undergo to the trauma they inflict on the animals, because without an intersectional approach, animal advocates fail to unmask the full extent of the violence. And when we talk about full extent of violence, again, we need to go back to the symbolic, psychological, linguistic processes that we tend to call dehumanization and animalization, where the two are really sort of the same thing. As Nick Haslam and Steve Lohan published in their article Dehumanization and Infrahumanization, there is now substantial evidence that the lowest of the low are most vulnerable to dehumanization, especially when humanness is understood as human uniqueness, a vertical dimension of comparison in which human amounts to being above animals. Now, what that essentially means is that being human in and of itself is actually not enough to be classified as fully human, at least fully human to the extent that you are perceived by those around you to have the same entitlements, same rights, to be entitled to the same treatment as others. Dehumanization and animalization impacts both human and non-human animals, often with very unfortunate and violent results. Fundamental to our movement, therefore, we have to understand that oppressions are not only connected, but they are often mutually constitutive. So what do I mean by mutually constitutive? That's a very verbose academic term. I don't love it. I think probably it's better explained in this slide. If we see on one side of sort of an imaginary binary here, the dehumanization of humans in order to exploit humans, and the animalization of non-human animals in order to exploit animals. These are not two separate things that occur. In fact, they exist in sort of a reciprocal feedback loop where one is constantly acting with and against the other. It's a chicken and egg scenario. Where does one end and the other begin? This figure of the non-human functions non-stop in the slaughterhouse. It functions as a symbolic comorbidity that renders both parties disposable and leaves power structures intact. So let's rethink this term comorbidity specifically for our purposes here. In clinical terms, as you all know, a comorbidity is a disease or a medical condition that is simultaneously present with another or others in a patient. That's not literally what I mean here. I think what we need to look at is this idea of comorbidity as a material and symbolic violence that is simultaneously present with multiple bodies in a place, specifically in the slaughterhouse, wherein we understand co as the symbolic linkage of non-human and human animals in the place, as bestial, as brutish, as disposable. And the idea of morbid is the ascription of social death and or biological death to both parties, albeit in very different degrees and very different kinds. And for those of you who are interested, social death is a very important term that comes from Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death from 1985, which refers to the condition of people not fully accepted as human by wider society. It is included as a loss of social identity, a loss of social connectedness, and losses associated with disintegration of the body. This idea that one can simultaneously be alive, but functionally almost be a part of a living dead. So when I talk about solidarity with slaughterhouse workers on the line, well, who actually are the people who day in and day out are the ones who have to go in and kill those tens of billions of animals? Well, 65%, at least in the United States, are people of color. And again, these statistics are the ones that we can actually find because it's actually a little harder than one might think to find the stats, given that 40% of the industry in the US is composed of immigrants, and the estimates of 14% of undocumented immigrants in some plants. It's hard to say how reliable that even is, because obviously if one is undocumented, you prefer to keep that status on the down low. For those who are employed in the industry, they'll often work 12 to 14-hour shifts, and for the high salary of $27,000 or less. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 6 to 8% of all early pandemic COVID deaths and 3 to 4% of COVID deaths overall were often attributed to those working on the front line of slaughterhouses. Even when COVID was not going on, slaughterhouse line work was considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, with some of the worst worker protections. There are physical consequences of slaughter. It is a profession full of crippling pain and backbreaking labor. And I don't mean that symbolically, I often mean that literally. This is an anonymous interview quote from a worker named Gabriel, who was interviewed for an article by NPR called Working the Chain. Gabriel says, once you get hurt, they are just waiting for these people to do a mistake to fire them because they don't want them over there. You sit down, you get tired, they fire you because they say you're sleeping. Reports coming out of the last 5 years, we have narratives of line workers literally wearing diapers to avoid having to go to the bathroom, very similar to the stories we hear out of Amazon warehouses. The intensive noise that comes from slaughterhouse work has been attributed to hearing loss. You work in extreme cold or extreme heat, meaning one is at great risk of either overheating or of hypothermia. The long-term effects of the physical labor of being in a slaughterhouse, working in the slaughterhouse, has been studied and attributed to musculoskeletal disorders. Working around harsh chemicals had resulted in chemical burns, throat burns, and the sicknesses that come with being around harsh chemicals all day. And that's not even counting for the most dangerous part of the job, which is literally limb amputations from blade-induced injuries. But that doesn't even account for the psychological consequences that come with working on the front line of a slaughterhouse. An anonymous interviewee in the book Slaughterhouse, The Shocking Story of Greed, Neglect, and Inhumane Treatment Inside the US Meat Industry, said, if you work in that stick pit for any period of time, you develop an attitude that lets you kill things but doesn't let you care. You may look a hog in the eye that's walking around down in the blood pit with you and think, God, that really isn't a bad looking animal. You may want to pet it. Pigs down on the kill floor have come up and nuzzled me like a puppy, and 2 minutes later I had to kill them, beat them to death with a pipe. I can't care. As you can see from that quote, there's a great deal of emotional distress that comes along with being employed in a profession that requires you to be around non-human animals with which you might for one moment form a bond and for another immediately have to sever that bond. Narratives from former employees include tears, nightmares, mental breakdowns on the job, having to go to therapy, having a medical, psychological breakdown. There's actually a subtype of PTSD that has been attributed to slaughterhouse work. It's called PITS, perpetrated induced traumatic stress, which, if you'll believe it, is typically something that you see in former military members who have had to engage in violence on the field. And that's often a trauma that can cause violent spillovers into families or communities. So to be clear, there is no research that suggests that individuals predisposed to violence are the ones who choose this work. It's actually not violent people who want the job, but the job has a correlation with creating violence in people, whether that be violent towards themselves emotionally or violence that spills over into people around them through trauma. And of course, there are broader cultural consequences to being employed in this industry. And largely that brings us back to this concept of having one's humanness not only taken away through physical abuse and psychological torture, but just through culture. There's an activist named Virgil Butler. He's a former slaughterhouse worker who's turned into an animal activist. He says, if that means ripping that chicken in half, that means ripping its leg off, that means ripping its foot off, you do it. Because if you don't do it, you're fired. There's no choice. They'll tell you straight up, you are the most expendable human beings on earth. What this means is essentially, in addition to the risk of physical death that can come with slaughterhouse work on the lines, social death, that idea of living death that we discussed, where one is literally pushed to the social margins. I mean, this comes out. The pay is awful and the turnover is high, but for many of the people employed on the line, due to maybe their undocumented status or for other reasons, it's an inability to escape poverty, where these are the jobs that are open and these are the conditions of the job. Because far cry from the meatpacking unionization of the Upton Sinclair era, union busting has effectively destroyed the industry. And it's very easy to union bust due to the fact that immigration and undocumentation, fears of deportation can basically ensure that collective advocacy becomes extremely difficult to do. But even more concerningly, it has been studied that if, for example, a slaughterhouse worker ends up in court as a criminal defendant for some reason, they are more likely to be criminalized by a prosecuting attorney or a judge, because the assumption can often be, well, if this person engages in such a violent profession, well, they themselves must be predisposed to violence. That doesn't even include the random people around you or the random people who make assumptions about you as other for having the gall to do that job. And of course, the environmental injustice that comes along with being employed in that place, having to live near that place, and dealing with issues such as spillover or the other environmental pollutants that come along with living next door to slaughter. And meanwhile, who gets to walk away? John Tyson, founder of Tyson Foods during COVID-19, said that meat is essential as healthcare. And James Sullivan, CEO of Smithfield, said that social distancing is a nicety that makes sense only for people with laptops. While their frontline workers, the ones who do the labors, line their pockets, they swim in profit and plausible deniability. Think back to those investigatory videos of slaughterhouse workers kicking, choking, abusing animals in their care. You can do a rhetorical pivot point as a CEO to a few bad apples, where the problem is not the industry itself. The problem is merely this one guy who has now been fired. You can veer into the race and class carceral politics of abuse an animal, go to jail, where the problem again becomes the one or two very bad, perhaps undocumented people who, I guess we just shouldn't have hired, but don't worry, they're replaceable. Meanwhile, there's no disruption to animal agribusiness as a whole. CEO Donnie King made 13.2 mil last year. Top 5 execs together at Tyson, 36.5 mil, and the company's net worth at Tyson Food is 20.32 billion. The problem is not these workers on the front line. The problem is something that goes all the way to the top and, quite frankly, functions predominantly from the top down. So we don't have to like the work that slaughterers, which is to say those precariously employed on the front line, do. But we do have to acknowledge how the tippy top of animal agribusiness dehumanizes its most vulnerable employees for its own benefit. Slaughterers don't slaughter as a dream job. I mean, obviously I can't speak for all of them, but their own bodies, their psyches, their communities suffer because of their day jobs. Animal agribusiness harms everyone who is animalized. And this animalization is a comorbidity that accompanies life in the slaughterhouse, whether one is a human animal or a non-human animal. Oppressions in general are interconnected. Because animals are disposable, at least as we understand them under that categorization, we have to fight for all of them, human and non-human, to combat the cycle of speciesist violence. And so for that reason, we need to think very hard about labor politics, agribusiness labor politics, as we think about our own animal advocacy. And I'm going to stop sharing there.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And if anyone has any questions, please post in the chat. We're a small group, so feel free to raise your hand too. And it says, may we have links to the references? Yeah.
Yes, I've stopped including the bibliography slide because I realized no one can ever see it, but I'd be happy to get the actual, I can create a bibliography and send it out for all the resources that I used for this.
We can send it, out to everybody. Yeah, and I think I thought Smithfield was China owned. Yeah, it is WH Group, but I think they do have executives in the United States, right?
Yeah, this was that one. Yeah.
And you bring up Tyson, how their CEO made $13 million. And meanwhile, they got $29 million of our taxpayer money for bailing them out for bird flu, while they made $20 billion or whatever. It's like our tax, whether we consume their products or not, our tax dollars are going to prop up this company. And we often don't think of veterinarians in terms of slaughterhouse workers, because there are many veterinarians working in slaughterhouses. And I think a lot of activists are especially angry at veterinarians because we are viewed as people in positions of power who could work any job. Why are you working at a slaughterhouse? And I know from talking to many veterinarians who work in slaughterhouses and who work in depopulation that they kind of get lured into this path. They have problems with general practice, working with dogs and cats. And I think a lot of veterinarians are struggling right now with general practice and working with dogs and cats, because there is this weird issue of like, people view their pets as commodities and are angry that medical care costs so much when their animal doesn't cost that much. And a lot of people breed animals for profit. And then I don't think we have the tools to grapple with all of these issues. We're not taught this in school. And then so we end up working in slaughterhouses like, oh, this is easier, and you're providing a much needed service, feeding the nation. And then we're confronted with this, like, oh, this is the harsh reality of producing food that is needed. And then when there are concerns, and I've even heard veterinarians be threatened when they try to enforce the law, threatened with being killed even when they're trying to enforce regulations, because these slaughter companies rely on staying open for profit, and they're just used to interacting with their own workers in this violent way. Like, it's just this culture of violence that feeds up on itself. So I'd just like to point out that veterinarians too are also slaughterhouse workers. And Stephanie says, I say, as a former dairy worker and former thank you. This was great. The idea of comorbidity is also important. Compassion is compassion for the whole system. I agree. And I say this as a former dairy worker and former large animal veterinarian too. Yeah. I've heard a lot of vets threatened for stopping the line, and we need to talk about that. Like, we need to tell those stories more. So many people are scared to tell the stories. It's like, I hear all the stories, and I want to write something about this, but we all need to start talking about the threats more. And I think a lot of veterinarians don't want to talk about it because they will be attacked by activists for like, oh, how dare you have worked in that system? And then they'll also be attacked by their colleagues who are like, you're being wimpy and unrealistic. Like, there's no safe place to go. And I hope our honor at least can be a safe place to go. You know, we are here to support you in all of this. Oh yeah, and ag gag laws try to scare people away from reporting abuses. And I know I've been threatened too. And it's like, somebody will try to take away your license, and you have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to deal with. You're like, how am I going to pay my bills? Like, yeah, veterinarians are very much victims of this whole thing. Yeah, Ontario's had the big win against ag gag laws too. Yeah, any other comments, America? We were just kind of just pondering this whole thing.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Anyone else with any questions? Anyone else know anybody?
Oh, how did I get into this topic? Actually, how I got into this topic is the weirdest story in the whole world. Back when I was in graduate school, I I took a course called Zombie Futurities, which was a course that tried to teach me about zombies from an academic perspective. And obviously that was pointless, but it introduced me to some scholars who do very good work on this idea of how we create monsters through language and through categories. And I thought I had to think to myself, well, who is categorized as monsters? Obviously many animals, but also many people who work in proximity to animals or who work a job that is often considered violent. And I always thought back to one time I was having dinner with my dad, who at the time was eating meat. He was literally at the grill with some brats, and he was complaining about his sister's daughter's boyfriend who couldn't be trusted because he killed his own animals. And I looked at him, I said, you have meat on the grill right now. Why is that different? And he said, it just is. And it's a weird way to get into the topic, but that's really how I got into the topic.
Yeah, and I know the rationale of a lot of people who do kill their own animals. It's like, well, you eat meat, like you are being wimpy and you're not taking responsibility for the meat that you eat if you don't actually kill the animal that you're eating, which is somewhat true. Like, hey, if you can't just take the pleasures, the spoils of the victim and not actually take part in it. So there's something to that. I just posted a link too in the chat of, we have a support group for people involved who are USDA inspectors who are involved in depopulation. So if you took part or know anybody and you want to join us in our support group and share your story, and honestly or not, like, please fill out that survey there too.
And where should I send the list of references? Because I'll put that together right after this.
Yeah, send it to info@ourhonor.org and I can send it to everybody else too.
Okay.
Yeah. Interesting, such a huge impact meat eating has that people are not conscious of. Yeah, it just affects everything. And yeah. All right, I know this talk was only scheduled for 30 minutes, so we can go ahead and end it, but thank you all for coming. And thank you, Marek, and I hope to see you again with another topic in the future. This was wonderful. And yeah, thank you all. I'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.